This is David Ross, and welcome once again to the Lion's Roar. I've discussed this topic to death, but I'm going to do it again, which is why is real history important? What practical, what practical use does it have for us when we're practicing every day? What happened, in the Ming Dynasty? But I would think that there is quite a lot of practical application. But let's talk about, for example, classic examples. I wasn't the only one that caught it. Someone else jumped on too. There was an ad that was like, all martial arts under heaven comes from Shaolin. It was a T-shirt design, and this famous, I would say infamous quote about, and then it went on to talk about how, all martial arts originated at Shaolin, which is absurd on every level. First of all, the idea that all martial arts all originate from one single source, as if people that were fighting for thousands of years never developed methods on their own until this one place. It's the same argument, and again, we're talking about this when people talk about, Japanese martial arts came from Kung Fu, or Kung Fu, Chinese martial arts came from Japanese martial arts. It's neither is 100% true, and neither is 100% fault. But let's talk about Shaolin just for a moment. And again, there's a lot of good stuff out there about Shaolin now, accurate stuff. But let us remember that if we look at the historical record, why is history important? We can find records of, and again, when we talk about Kung Fu, when we talk about Chinese martial arts, we're talking about not just, military methods, but what we generally tend to think of as martial arts being some combination of unarmed and armed, but with a significant amount of unarmed. Well, there's not a huge record going all the way back, but we start having a record around the Song Dynasty. And certainly, with General Qi's book and a couple other sources, we have, some indication of it in the Ming. And then, of course, in the Qing, it's everywhere. And you read all the documentation regarding the Boxer Rebellion, for example, the Boxer Uprising. Now, in my history book, I did suggest that, we are victim to the sources. So in other words, if martial arts people were practicing and they were just using it for self-defense and health, may not have gotten into a record where we would have seen it. Obviously, we see it so much in the Qing because it's so associated not just with the Boxer Uprising, but with other uprisings and, discontent. And, we see it in General Qi because, he had a personal interest in it and he included it. Only later to have second thoughts about it. But we have a record. We also have a record talking about Shaolin. Now in Shaolin, they have the militia. And I always point out the militia as evidence that it's not what people think of, this glorious idea that Buddhist monks are practicing for spiritual advancement. They were doing that to a certain extent. But originally, Shaolin had a militia for a very simple reason, which was to protect themselves, self-defense, and also to protect their interests, i.e. their land. There's a record of, the militia, and they were using staffs, and, there's some record that might have been iron-coated staffs, and they were good fighters. But we're not talking about unarmed kind of stuff, what we think of as modern Kung Fu. That doesn't appear till much later. General Qi talks about their staff. There's a lot of references to their staff. But as far as unarmed, late Ming at the earliest, maybe Qing period. But yet we know we have Chinese martial arts back in the Song and the Ming. So, and the Yuan, the Song Yuan and Ming. So you can't create something when you didn't show up until after it was already created, obviously. It should be obvious. But yet there's so many of this, Shaolin. And as far as what was done at Shaolin, we've pointed out numerous times, martial arts didn't leave Shaolin and then go around China. Chinese martial arts were adopted by Shaolin. So, it's not surprising that a lot of what's in the quote-unquote Shaolin curriculum is stuff that was popular in the surrounding regions. In other words, people around them were practicing martial arts. The monks that came, in fact, from the surrounding areas often. A lot of them had martial arts training before they came in. I talk about this again in my book. I really do. Go and look at it. So, this is one example of, putting the cart before the horse kind of thing, and just getting a complete. And then, because what happens is when you think that all martial arts came out of Shaolin, and you think that Shaolin, only did martial arts for, spiritual, religious reasons, then you think that all martial arts are of originally religious or spiritual, as opposed to Shaolin first started doing martial arts for fighting, the militia to protect their interests, and that they adopted arts that had been created outside, that had been practiced in villages for militia training. I was amused also recently that I used the term militia, and somebody that was arguing with me about history didn't even know what the term meant, which really says a lot. I mean, if you haven't read the literature. The real historical literature that has relationship to these kind of discussions, the discussion of militia and violence on the local level is it's actually pretty extensive literature, if you can, out there, and it's not just in Chinese. It's certainly extensive in Chinese, but there's so much of it translated. I touch on so much of it in my book, but even more has come out since the book. I'm kind of shocked, actually. The book came out in 2017, so we're going on 5-6 years. That book is, and so much has come out even since then, which is, why I've toyed with doing an update or doing a second version of it. But, with the pandemic, I just have so much going on, and I'm just trying to function. So, I don't know, we'll see. But there's out there. And if you don't know what militia is, it shows you're not really reading what the literature is out there. Another thing that popped up again, I had this thing where I pointed out that somebody was, self-professed expert and said some ridiculous things. I mean, the most ridiculous was that there was no wrestling associated with the military. Again, there are accounts of this. There are paintings and images of this. By the Song, military people were all doing wrestling. Now, of course, we can have that argument like Paleokov has in, speaking about the Greeks also. What is exactly the relationship between training and unarmed fighting and combat? That's a different story. But it's sort of a universal human experience, because we look at paleograph and we look at classical Greece, and then we look at China, and we can look at Japan and other places. Soldiers enjoyed and practiced unarmed martial arts as well as battlefield combat weapon training, weapon martial arts, fighting with spears and swords and shields and, group formations. To say that they didn't is just completely trying to rewrite the record and trying to sweep mountains of documents under the rug. But another thing, the idea that, martial arts didn't were all striking, which was another claim that was made. And I had to go into this because it was brought up again. But very simply, the argument goes like this. There is no reference in the Qing and Ming period to Shuai Fa, the term that we use nowadays to refer to throwing techniques. Shui is, Shui Jiao, Shuai Fa. Well, in the Qing and the Ming, they didn't refer to any kind of wrestling as Shui Jiao. Shui Jiao is a 20th century term. Most likely, most evidence, almost all the evidence points to Ma Liang. I mean, to the point where Ma Liang's book on wrestling, the foreword, he gets some people to write the foreword, and in the foreword, these people call it Jiao Li because that's the term that was used for wrestling in China up until, the beginning of the Republic period. So to say, well, there's no reference to Shuai Fa, so there was no throwing, it's a straw man argument. It's a fake argument. There are other terms that were used to describe throwing techniques. When we look at General Chi's book, there is descriptions of the techniques in the quote unquote classic of the fist classic, unarmed fighting classic, and techniques that are clearly throws. They don't use shui, though, because it's a 20th century term. They use different terms for it. But there's throws in there. It's also, it's a stilted argument, too. They're saying, well, that's, mid to late Ming. Before that, well, like I said, most of the systems that we have date to late Ming, early Qing, at the oldest. So, you can't say Chinese Kung Fu, Kung Fu is, we understand, is late Ming, early Qing. So you can't say, well, we don't have references to them doing throwing, because we don't have references to them really in general. Though, Shobo, which we do have references for, does seem to be a system that mixed striking and grappling. So even that's wrong. I don't know why people make these arguments, especially when they should know better, and in some cases I suspect they do know better, other than clickbait. I mean, the famous argument that the kicks of karate came from French savate is clearly just clickbait. Let's just call it what it was. I mean, I went through a big thing about, how it makes zero sense, and if you know anything about any kind of history whatsoever, there's plenty of interesting things to argue about. Probably the thing I'm going to start with next is asking the question about whether what we understand now is Qigong. Everybody says, well, it comes from Dalian, the Taoist gymnastics. But maybe it came from Swedish gymnastics. People are going, what? Well, even there's an article in one of the most prominent yoga journals that suggests that yoga in India was more meditative practices, and the physical yoga, or the asana yoga, came after the European physical culture movement, which started off as Swedish gymnastics, which came actually from fencing, European martial arts. And when you look at Perling's Swedish gymnastics, you see movements that, look so much like Qigong. And then we wonder, well, a lot of the sources that we have for Qigong came from military men who were doing military gymnastics, German military gymnastics, which had been influenced by the Swedish gymnastics. And so, with a nationalist trend that came about, especially in the, the Republican period with the Gulshu movement, were they taking Swedish gymnastic movements and, like the bend forward and view the sea and a bunch of other movements that we, are so essential to Chinese Qigong traditions. We see them in Swedish gymnastics and in military gymnastics. Did they take those movements and then just say, well, they're Chinese, and then, rewrote it to say, well, they came from Dalian, but maybe they didn't? This is the kind of stuff we can have discussions about. This is interesting. This is important. And again, why is it important? Well, because it shows that, again, if you look at Ma Liang's books, which is hard because it's hard to get copies of them, and nobody wants to talk to them about them because Ma Liang was a traitor. This is why history is important. If Ma Liang hadn't ended up being a traitor, maybe we would have a much more modern approach to Chinese martial arts, because that's what he was trying to do. Maybe Chinese martial arts would be practiced more like MMA is now, and not like it is now, But his project failed, even though he had made great success initially leading up to it, because he was labeled a traitor, because he collaborated with the Japanese, in the Japanese-Chinese, war, what we call World War II. But when you look at his stuff, it's modern. It's attempting to take things that he was exposed to in modern military training and mix them with, Kung Fu. And there's other people in the Republic period doing this. If they were too nationalistic and they wanted to make everything like it was, ancient Chinese stuff that they had just been holding on to, holding up their sleeve, hiding behind the curtain, and they suddenly reveal. But a lot of it clearly is influenced by, Western European advancements and by their experience in the quote-unquote new army and the new military training. That's more interesting than, trying to claim that all martial arts were created by Buddhist monks at Shaolin, which is just absurd, or these straw men that there's no grappling in martial arts, as if any martial art would not have grappling. And again, I mean, grappling, if you know anything about, military history or apology, the development of weapon arts. And you look in Europe to see this very clearly. People that were practicing to fight with swords weren't necessarily developing methods of striking with their fists. They were developing two things. Low-line kicking, which is interesting, obviously, if you look at some Chinese martial arts, because when their hands were occupied with the weapons, and I've talked about this a million times, you could kick someone in the shin, but also throwing, because even with an armored person, you could throw somebody down. I mean, that's sort of the origin of judo, which comes from jiu-jitsu, which came from the training that samurai did. Somebody has armor, you can knock them over, knock them down, and then, once they're knocked down and on the ground, it's easier to kill them. So, and this would explain the interest of armies in China, both Han ethnic armies and Manchurians and Mongolians and Tibetans, in doing wrestling. Now, they did wrestling for ritual, they did wrestling for recreation, but they also did it for combat. And of course, I talk about how the Mongolians have a term. Everybody knows Bok, which is the sport form, which they certainly did also, and which influenced the Shampuying and, led to modern Shuai. But they also have a term for specifically wrestling for combat. Drager was the first person to write about it in English. It's about 2 paragraphs in one of his books. I found very few references other than that, but it's there. To argue that there's no grappling, it's all striking, and then, when you bring up all these examples and they go, well, that's because, Shuai influenced them in the early Qing. Well, a lot of these systems, that's when they came from, and of course they were surrounded by wrestling because it was there from the very beginning. They're false arguments. I think a lot of them clickbait, to be perfectly honest. But it's important to realize, right, that nothing comes from one source. The idea that you have to stay true to your Chinese martial arts, as if that was ever true. I mean, and again, when we look at history, Wushu movement, they were looking at Japanese martial arts because Japanese martial arts had been more modernized than Japanese martial arts like Jukendo, which was, training with the bayonet, and Kendo, which was a more modern way of training with the sword. They wanted to study and copy these methods. Now, is there Chinese influence on Japan? Of course there is. Was some Chinese martial arts influential on Japanese martial arts? Of course, Japanese martial arts existed before because the Japanese people, like anybody else, were fighting. But we know that cultures interacted and knowledge goes in 2 directions. But there's also Western influence. Japanese influence on Chinese martial arts, Western influence on martial arts, Western influence on Japanese martial arts. The Japanese martial arts that were influencing the Chinese were influenced first by Western martial arts. And I would argue that, Perdeling and, the Swedish gymnastic movement, which came out of basically European martial artists developing, more systematic methods of physical training, that led to the German military gymnastics, which influenced this whole generation of men who were interested in Chinese martial arts, but it also had this training and tried to modernize their Kung Fu. And of course, I've argued all these things a million times before, but I would argue that Chinese martial arts would have been better off if it had been modernized and that project had been completed. If the Guoshu, Academy, Central Guoshu Academy had been allowed to function, if there hadn't been a war with the Japanese, obviously if the nationalist government had been more capable and less corrupt. But, that's history. As always, thanks for tuning in.